Dr. Grace, the world is counting on you.
Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary is one of the best-selling sci-fi novels of the last decade. So, when Ryan Gosling signed on to bring Ryland Grace to life, book fans had one burning question: can they get it right? Well, from the early buzz, it's safe to say that the critics and audience both are loving it. And honestly, if you ask me, it's pretty faithful. But pretty faithful is not the same as perfectly faithful. Directors Phil Lord and Christopher Miller had to squeeze a 496-page novel into a 156-minute film, and something had to give. So today, we're breaking down every single change, big and small, that was made in the book to film process. And trust me, some of those will surprise you. Let's begin. Grace remains involved instead of returning to teaching. If we look at the story of the novel chronologically, then Ryland Grace is recruited into the study of astrophage primarily because he challenges the very idea that extraterrestrial life requires a traditional Goldilocks zone. But soon, his assumption is proven wrong, and it becomes clear that the aliens consuming the sun are water-based. Now, in the film, this is a huge turning point for Grace, who immediately gets engaged in the project and refuses to be dismissed. However, in the book, Grace steps back after the revelation and returns to his role as a teacher. It is only after he realized that his students represent the generation who is at a great risk from the upcoming crisis that he decides to rejoin the mission. That gave his choice a stronger moral and emotional foundation, but the makers decided to keep the story linear and made Grace immediately hop on the operation. The film removed the coma resistance gene plotline. Okay, this one's a major change. The coma-resistant gene played a significant role in Grace joining the mission. In the novel, Weir chalked out the journey to Tau Ceti, requiring astronauts who would have to spend years in induced comas because, Tau Ceti is some 12 light years away? Also, the coma was necessary to adjust to the limited space aboard Hail Mary. Consequently, only individuals with a rare genetic trait that allows them to survive prolonged coma states were considered viable candidates. This was an extremely crucial criterion in the recruitment process, narrowing the pool of participants. And believe me, Ryland Grace was not initially intended to be part of the crew. He came in after the primary scientist and his backup were killed in an explosion. Basically, Grace was selected as a replacement. This decision was driven by two factors. One, his extensive knowledge of astrophage, and two, the discovery that he possessed the necessary coma-resistant gene. The film, however, oversimplified this plotline. It removed the genetic testing and the screening level altogether, and if you haven't read the book, you'd be wondering why specific individuals were selected for the mission. When it came to other crew members, such as Yao and Iliukina, they still appeared briefly, but their roles are heavily trimmed, and many interactions that mark the development of Grace's relationship with them, particularly his involvement in their training, are cut. As a result, the movie ended up placing less emphasis on the team dynamic and streamlined the narrative to focus more tightly on Grace's travel. Grace's memory recovery is more gradual in the book. Project Hail Mary began with Ryland Grace awakening alone on a spaceship, with no recollection of who he is or how on Earth he ended up there. I mean, how on space? Weir took a slower and more detailed approach to Grace, remembering who he was. In the beginning, he spent quite some time struggling to recall basic information about himself. The man had no clue what his name was, let alone his profession, or his purpose for being on a spaceship. His memories returned gradually through a series of flashbacks, revealing events leading up to the expedition. Even then, it was after repeated moments of realization before he fully understood his situation. The film, on the other hand, moved through Grace's phase of self-discovery quite quickly, allowing him to regain his identity at a faster pace, understandably due to time constraints. The Hail Mary spacecraft is redesigned and expanded in the film. In the film, Grace got a room from where he could see simulations of Earth and even a domed entertainment room for watching media. While this worked well for creating more emotionally engaging moments, highlighting Grace's homesickness and letting Rocky experience a piece of Earth, they are created totally by the makers. Yes, you heard that right. Hail Mary was nowhere close to being a spacious and lavish spacecraft in the novel. The author originally envisioned it as a simple and compact interstellar vehicle with just a few stacked rooms and a storage area. It kind of resembled a basic and frankly, a simple, no frills design, but the creators of the movie went all in. They did not want to restrict Hail Mary to just a setting. Rather, they reimagined it as a tool in developing Grace's character and his connection to Rocky. Hence came the visually complex designs with a central living section surrounded by rotating components. In a way, it also offered a more scientific depiction of how such a vessel might function. The film replaces inner monologue with video logs. Absolutely loved those scenes where Ryan Gosling held the camera close to his beautiful face and kept a record of incidents through the video logs. However, Grace's videos were a replacement for his inner dialogues in the book. There, he did not record messages for Earth. Readers already experienced the story through his first-person narration. which conveyed almost everything, including his thoughts and sense of humour. Obviously, adapting this internal perspective to the screen was not an easy feat, so the movie chose to follow the logging technique used in Matt Damon's The Martian. From early on, the ship's computer encouraged Grace to record logs, and though he was reluctant at first, he eventually gave in. Grace then began making vlogs along with Rocky to document their research and talk about the situation, which helped the narrative to move ahead without relying on voiceover narration or breaking the fourth wall. Food is much more important in the novel. Food is one of the most crucial survival aspects that the film downplayed, and honestly, this is one complaint I have from the movie. You can't treat food as something trivial, and Andy Weir was very particular about this in the novel. He expressed the availability of food as a constant concern, since the mission was originally intended to be a one-way journey, and the crew spent most of it in a coma. Grace repeatedly worried about whether his limited food supply would be enough to keep him alive. The issue became even more worrisome when his situation changed. He had to carefully manage his remaining rations to live. That included the extra food left behind after Yao and Iliyukina's deaths, as well as the unappetizing coma slurry, which was described as tasting like aspirin. He even considered whether Rocky's food could help, but on analysing it, he knew that it would be toxic for humans. The movie, however, thought it would be wise to just briefly touch on differences in eating habits, and even reversed a moment from the book by having Rocky feel uncomfortable eating in front of Grace because it was considered gross. The food stakes rose even higher in the novel when Grace chose to save Rocky, fully aware that doing so could leave him without enough food to survive. His troubles finally ended when Grace realised that he could sustain on Talmiba. Weir also winks at cannibalism in a dark yet humorous way when Iridian scientists managed to replicate a sample of Grace's muscle tissue to create meat that he can consume. He called them me burgers because he was essentially eating his own body. Grace's loneliness. See, Ryland Grace was the protagonist in both the book and the film, but there are considerable differences as to how one can portray the same character in these two mediums. The length of the book allowed the writer to dedicate a notable portion to Grace's time alone before he came across Rocky. Grace was described as being composed during this time, and by the time he met Rocky, he had already started figuring out his circumstances. He was thus actively working through the many challenges he faced. The film, in contrast, used this period differently, particularly for humour. For instance, Grace clumsily navigated the ship as he came to terms with his new life. Sadly, this even affected Rocky's introduction in the movie because, according to the actual story, it was meant to be an unexpected turning point, which ultimately turned out to be less surprising on the screen. The movie cuts much of Grace's life before space. Grace's adventures with Rocky in space occupied most of Project Hail Mary's focus in the book, and this was kept intact in the movie as well. But funnily enough, the movie went with a no-poop policy, where it cut out the part where Grace observed Rocky's eating, digestion, and excretion cycle. Anyway, coming to Grace's time on Earth, both versions included flashbacks as his memory gradually returned. The film did show some of it, Grace working with Astrophage, his life as a teacher, and becoming involved in Project Hail Mary. Yet, it did not portray nearly as much of his pre-space life as the book. Several sequences from the novel that explored Grace's life before leaving Earth were completely removed in the adaptation. For example, Grace figured out the process for breeding astrophage in the film, just like in the book, and taught his methods to scientists around the world so the microscopic aliens could be multiplied and used as fuel for the Hail Mary. However, the film omitted the involvement of a criminal engineer and the covering of the Sahara Desert with solar panels. Other storylines which went poof on the screens included Eva Stratt setting up the broader astrophage breeding centre, even the drastic measures like nuking Antarctica to release methane and stored carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to cope with the harsh climate changes were completely snipped out. Supporting characters are reduced or altered in the film. True, the movie significantly minimised the roles of most supporting characters, but interestingly, it fleshed out some of the novel's characters a lot more. The biggest example was Eva Stratt, who was played by Sandra Huller. Stratt was the closest thing to a villain in the novel, where she was a cold and calculating bit, well, you know the word. She did not care about anything except the mission, and did not hesitate once before making some hard choices. Lord and Miller, however, softened her in the movie, where she was seen having playful interactions with Grace, and even performing a karaoke version of Harry Styles' Sign of the Times, a scene added in the film to humanise her character and give her a rare moment of vulnerability. The movie also created another character, Carl, a security officer out of thin air, to add a comic element to the story and provide Grace with someone to discuss his ideas with. The real cause of Grace's amnesia was changed. The film went a little too far in humanising Eva Stratt's character. I already told you that Grace had a hard time figuring out who he was. Well, in the movie, Mary explained that Grace's amnesia was an expected side effect of an induced coma. The novel, however, gave a much more twisted explanation, and the culprit was none other than Stratt. She gave Grace a special dose of a French interrogation drug, DGSE, which was designed to erase his memory for several weeks. Why, you may ask? Since Grace did not want to volunteer for the Hail Mary mission and was forced into an induced coma before launch, the drug was used to make sure he forgot the circumstances of his selection, ensuring he would not panic or sabotage the mission upon awakening. It was also meant to make him believe that he had at some point agreed to participate voluntarily. The movie, however, makes no mention of this drug, removing an important layer of Grace's anger towards Strat at the end of the story. The connection between the Blip A and the Hail Mary is simplified. In the movie, the Blip A connected to the Hail Mary in a comparatively simpler manner, that is by extending a xenonite tunnel that latched directly onto the ship's airlock. In Andy Weir's novel, the tunnel could not be formed until after Grace removed a part of his own ship to send a metal sample to the mysterious aliens. There is another notable difference about the Blip A. In the book, Grace could never board the Blip A because the combination of heat, pressure and atmosphere would have instantly killed him. The filmmakers bypassed this limitation cleverly by having Rocky build a xenonite suit, which allowed Grace to clumsily travel inside the alien ship. Collecting Talmiba is streamlined in the film. When we saw Grace and Rocky working together to create a long chain that allows them to scoop Talmiba from Adrian's atmosphere, it felt perfectly aligned with the book. However, if you notice carefully, there was a difference in how much time this process took. In the novel, the duo had to construct miles upon miles of chain, and the effort practically drove them crazy. But the film eased this effort and showed the task almost as a piece of cake. Now, after successfully collecting Talmiba, the Hail Mary nearly faces disaster, power systems fail, and intense gravity almost crushes Grace. So far, so good. However, the movie skips over a critical event from the book around that time when a Talmiba leak consumed all of the ship's fuel. In the novel, Grace was then forced to use astrophage from the Beatles to return to the Blip A and refuel. Yes, the Beatles remain part of the story in the film, but they do not receive the same attention as in the book. There was a part where Grace learnt about the mini astrophage-powered ships from a nerdy scientist who designed and named them. Yeah, that was also omitted. The next removal is quite odd actually. The selective breeding of Talmiba. In the book, Grace worked really hard to adapt the organisms for nitrogen-rich atmospheres, with discussion of their potential use on Venus. However, the directors chose not to mention whether the astrophage predator could survive on Rocky's home planet, 3-world, equivalent to Venus. The Talmiba danger is shortened on screen. See, the broad idea that the Talmiba would eventually affect the astrophage fuel and Grace helping Rocky is more or less the same in both the novel and the movie. I said more or less because the crisis element in it, as in the build up to this moment, had been somewhat toned down in the adaptation. Weir basically harped about the Talmiba being dangerous, including the fuel leak I mentioned. The film, on the other hand, established the threat with only a few lines of dialogue. Moreover, Grace and Rocky's life-threatening moments also played out differently, which brings us to our next entry. Grace did not save Rocky in the film. The book and the film both showed the dramatic moment when Rocky left his protective enclosure to save Grace after an accident while collecting a sample of Adrian's atmosphere. However, what happened afterward differed a lot between the two versions. In the book, Grace dragged Rocky back to his part of the ship, exposing himself to the hostile Iridian environment and suffered many injuries. Grace then brought back Rocky to the enclosed space he made for himself inside the Hail Mary ship. He then attempted to heal Rocky by performing a series of cleanings, believing they would help the alien recover. Grace even blew air into Rocky's carapace to remove what he perceived as black soot, which Rocky later explained could have killed him. The novel actually emphasised the science behind Rocky's biology in more detail, but Lord and Miller behaved like an uncontrolled barber who cut out these portions. Here, Rocky crawled back on his own while Grace was unconscious, and Grace did nothing out of the way to save him. Sure, he was a bit loopy on pain meds in the novel after getting burns from Rocky's touch, but him not frantically trying to save Rocky honestly hurt. When he woke up, he waited for Rocky to come around and did a lot of science stuff. He did not treat any burns, suffer from pain medication, or attempt the cleanings, thereby minimising Grace's active role in saving Rocky. The film did capture the affectionate tone between the two, but somewhere it was way too condensed. Rocky got an upgraded voice. Rocky and Grace did communicate in both the book and the movie, but how they do it is changed in the movie. Yes, Grace created a translator on his computer in each of the versions to convert Rocky's musical language into on-screen text prompts. The movie, however, went a step further by giving the program a voice provided by James Ortiz, so that Rocky's words are spoken aloud. This never happened in the book. There, Grace gradually learnt to understand Rocky directly without needing to rely on the technology. The change in the film, however, makes sense because the novel took readers inside Grace's mind. That means we could follow Rocky's meaning as he did, but the movie required a clear, audible way for viewers to understand Rocky and stay connected to Gosling's character. The film edited out the difficult scientific explanations. They probably did it for people like me, who have the brain of a chicken when it comes to scientific jargon. and thus the makers replaced Weir's meticulously researched attempt at scientific accuracy with a greater focus on the emotional connection between Grace and Rocky. The film almost completely dropped any and all scientific babble from the book in favour of character development and action sequences. It worked perfectly because the film never felt like a boring lecture. Reducing scientific talks also reduced the time Grace spent in doing science and solving problems in the book. For instance, we don't see him build the first astrophage breeder, or much of the process behind engineering Talmeba resilient enough to survive Venus and Erid's climate. I know that a little bit of techno words wouldn't have hurt those who were into harder sci-fi, but for the larger audience, this was a wise decision. Grace visiting Rocky's ship. There was a striking moment in the film which left us all teary-eyed. Yes, I'm talking about the sequence where Rocky gave Grace a goodbye gift as they prepared to return to their home planets. Rocky built Grace a suit, which served as the equivalent of an Iridian spacesuit, and the latter took a walk inside Rocky's ship. None of this happened in the book, and I absolutely encourage such delightful creative liberties that make us sniffle. Also, by this point in the film, audiences were practically dying to get a look inside Rocky's ship. Grace hasn't visibly aged during his time on Erid. I talked about the dangerous atmosphere on the Blip A, remember? The same heat and pressure also existed on Rocky's home planet, Erid, but for some magical reason, it did not affect Grace in the movie when he stayed there. Sure, the air was breathable and the temperature too was manageable, but Weir described Grace as being physically worn out from the extra gravity on the planet, which made it harder for him to move around. The ending of the film was the same as in the book. Grace stayed back on Erid and starting a new life as a teacher. He was unsure of whether he would ever return to Earth. However, in the film, it was made to look like that not much time had passed, which was clearly not the case in the book. The novel ended with readers learning that Grace had been living on Erid for 16 years, making him about 53 years old by his estimation. I guess that's the price you have to pay for having Ryan Gosling, because he was not made to look any older than he did throughout the rest of Project Hail Mary. That suggested that he had been living on Rocky's home planet for just a few years. He still appeared to be in the prime of his life and was rather enjoying the new status quo on Erid. But in the book, Grace had to use a cane to walk because the higher gravity made his bones degenerate faster, leading to arthritis. He himself deduced that 71 years had gone by on Earth since he was born, with the 18 years difference between his physical age a result of time-dilated travel. Still, Project Hail Mary chose to keep Grace younger even for this epilogue. Grace never gets his moment. What kind of sucked is that the film never gives Grace a direct, explicit confirmation that his mission worked. Instead, Rocky told him that the Erid scientists could send him back to Earth. But as I said, he decided to stay on Erid. But learning that his mission worked, and that Earth got the probes he sent back with Talmeba could kill the astrophage, was a huge moment for Grace. It's what makes everything worth it, and ripping that out was not really a good move. The movie took a different side, simply implying that Grace knew everything worked out in the end. Rather than actually showing the Iridians, telling Grace that the Earth's sun was back to full luminance, the movie chose to show Strat watching Grace's video recordings. Sure, that was enough to save humanity. It also deviated from the book in another aspect. Earth now knew about Rocky. God forbid Weyland Yutani gets a sniff of this. Jokes apart, in the book, Grace never sent any proof of alien life or about Rocky and Erid. He only sent the Talmeba samples encased in Iridian steel. But this ending opened a lot more doors to what Earth could do after saving the sun. And we know what a sucker Hollywood is for sequels if the movie is a hit. The other alteration they made to the climax was by expanding the view on Earth. We saw an elderly Strat playing Grace and Rocky's last and final video log, and that she was aboard an aircraft carrier moving through a frozen ocean. The novel kept it less dramatic. Readers got to know about the fate of Earth because Iridian scientists told Grace that the energy level of the sun was restored. The timeline issue. Though the movie's timeline was never clearly mentioned, it's difficult to not feel how rushed the storytelling was. Rocky and Grace got to spend months together, studied the astrophage, and hatched a plan to stop it. By that point, the man had even mastered Rocky's musical way of speaking. The movie compressed all these events into what felt like just a couple of weeks, and Grace did not fully understand Rocky until the finale. Alright guys, that's all for today. Yes, I have my fair share of issues with some of the modifications, yet I can't help laud the makers for delivering such a masterpiece. And honestly, most of the differences between the novel and movie seemed inevitable, because we all know that at the end of the day, not every great book could be turned into a great movie without a director's creative vision. Do let us know your thoughts about the movie in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one. And if you liked this video, hit that like button and share it with your friends.